here today to tell you all about Windows containers and AKS on Azure Stack HCI and how you can use these technologies together to advance your business to either migrate to the cloud or to help you run your Windows Server applications on-prem with AKS on Azure Stack HCI. So the agenda is we're going to start by a high-level overview of Windows containers if you haven't heard them before. We're going to talk about some of the common use cases for containers, what is a container, all those sorts of things. We're going to have a demo where we go and inspect Windows containers and play around with them, start them, stop them, that sort of thing. And then we're going to transition over to an intro to AKS on Azure Stack HCI, the use cases for that, how you get started, and then we're going to end with a demo of deploying AKS on Windows Server. So with that being said, let's dive on right into the Windows containers overview. So now is better than ever to begin your journey with Windows containers. If you have never heard of Windows containers before, then hello. We'll talk about them in just a second. But more likely than not, you've probably heard of Windows containers by now. They've been around for over 6 years. We released them with the GA of Windows Server 2016, and since then, there's been a great adoption of Windows containers, both if we think internally about the services that Microsoft uses to provide and power Microsoft. If you've used Microsoft Teams before, then that is running in Windows containers. So Windows containers internally are battle tested and they're powering some of the largest Microsoft services. And then externally, we've also seen great adoption across the board in a variety of verticals. Customers using Windows containers to help migrate their workloads to the cloud more easily, to begin starting to integrate with Kubernetes and container orchestration so that they can run their Linux workloads and the Windows workloads under this common pane of glass, this Kubernetes being this common control plane, workload control plane that customers are really consolidating on. And so more on that in just a minute. But Windows containers, you talked briefly about they were released in Windows Server 2016. Here's a timeline dating back to the date that they originally GA'd back in October 2016. Since then, what have we been up to? Well, there's been a whole slew of features that we've been working on integrating into the platform, performance improvements as well, bug fixes, of course, as well as integrating with the broader container ecosystem. So since Windows Server 2016, we've had 2 new releases of the long-term servicing channel for Windows Server 2019 and Windows Server 2022. And in each of those releases, we've brought new capabilities and bug fixes and the like. On the top, you'll see Kubernetes. So if you haven't heard of Kubernetes, it's a container orchestrator, and Raymond later is going to tell you all about why container orchestrators are so important to your business and how they play an essential role in your use of containers generally. So the important thing to note is, when did Windows containers become stable and supported in Kubernetes? That was back in around 2020, April of 2020 is when we declared GA support of Windows containers in AKS in the cloud. And then later in May of 2021, when AKS HCI GA'd, that of course supported Windows containers too. So now we're sitting at April of 2022. It's been 6 years. And so they've been battle tested. They've a lot of improvements we've been working on. It's really great to see, and I think that there's a complete solution now, especially when you think about how well Windows containers now work within Kubernetes. So more on that in just a few minutes. Let's talk though about Windows containers, the technology, and generally that sort of thing. So how do Windows containers help you? I think about the biggest difference, like the biggest mindset shift is to stop worrying about the underlying infrastructure. Pains such as being stuck configuring VMs and patching and keeping these hosts up to date where your apps are running. Containers changes that model a little bit because it shifts it to you're taking your application, you're building it inside of a Windows container, and then that thing is self-contained. And once you have that container, you can go and run it anywhere that on a host that supports running containers. So Windows Server 2016 or later, or if you're talking about dev or test environments, the latest release of Windows 10 or 11. And so, how do the containers help you? It's a mindset change so that you're no longer worried about the underlying infrastructure. It shifts it, and you're just worried about that application layer. You don't have to worry about infrastructure bottlenecks, that sort of thing. And especially when you think about Kubernetes and all the wonderful capabilities that container orchestrators give you, we'll touch on that in just a minute, but it really, it does a lot of work for you, which is great. It automates more things. So, but what is a container? If you have not heard of Windows containers before, then welcome. This content is for you. More likely than not, you might have heard of Windows containers, but just really high level, a Windows container is you take your application, and your application usually has some dependencies. Say it's on .NET or something like that. These libraries and frameworks that are required for your application to run. So you take those two things, and then the last thing is this, what we call app configuration. So if you have registry keys that need to be set or other sort of configuration files, those three things together, you take them, you can package that up into this Windows container, and you effectively end up with this layers of files that you can then go and take and just create new instances of containers based on that bundle of files, let's say. And so we're going to, in just a minute, transition over to a demo where we're going to inspect and take a look at containers and that sort of thing. So this should all make more sense in just a moment. But the beautiful thing is once you have built this Windows container, because you have defined your application and its dependencies and its configuration, it's like a self-contained unit, you can go and take that, and it really makes it easier to deploy that app to any target environment that you want, provided it supports running Windows containers. So you can go and you can take it and you can deploy it in your on-prem infrastructure. Or you can go and take it and you can easily move it and run it in a set of Azure VMs. Or you can take it and run it on a managed container service like AKS, all those sorts of things. It really, containers greatly help improve your ease with which you go and deploy into these different environments because it's that self-contained thing. You don't have to worry about configuring the host. As long as it can run containers, it can run your container that you've built. So now we're going to transition over to a demo, and let's get our hands dirty with this, and let's take a look under the hood of a Windows container. So now we're in the demo portion. What we have on the right side is a terminal, and that terminal, there's actually two tabs. One is going to be this tab for a terminal that's going to execute inside the container, and then one's going to be from the host. And then on the left side is Process Explorer. And as you would expect, Process Explorer shows you a process tree of all these services and processes running on my machine where I'm doing this demo. And there's a lot of processes that Windows boots up to provide this interactive GUI experience that I currently have as a logged in user. And so we've got a list of processes on the left. This tree is going to change as I go and start and stop containers. So you'll see that in just a minute. But the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to use this thing called Docker. So Docker is a command line interface. It's a well-loved tool for going and you can use it to start containers, to stop them, to inspect them, to build them if you so please. So we're going to be using this thing called Docker. And the first thing we're going to do is dump a list of the container images that are on my local machine to run. And we're going to take this Windows Server Core image and we're going to run it. We're going to run it interactively and we're going to run it as a process isolated container. And then containers, of course, have versions with them. And so we're going to run the Windows Server 2022 version of the Server Core image. And inside the Server Core image, we're going to run PowerShell. And so on the left side here in Process Explorer, I can see these processes spinning up, and it's launched a whole little separate tree of processes. The big thing to call out here is notice in the session column, you can see these processes from here on down have a session 4, which is within the container. And so the cool thing I can do is I can look at the list of processes within the container, and it's going to show me all the ones associated with that container. Now, when I do it on the host and I do the same git process, it's going to show me, of course, everything. It's going to show me the same view that Process Explorer is because the host is like a super being. It can see everything. It's a super administrator, that sort of thing. But within the container, I can only see the processes associated with my container. So there's an isolation aspect that containers offer. Think of it as like booting up a pristine instance of Windows Server, Server Core version, Server 2022. And we can go and poke around. So what I'm going to do is let me first show off what's the identity within the container. So if I do a who am I within the container, it's going to show me I'm now this container administrator identity, which of course is not the identity I have on the host. If I do that, it's going to show you my alias. And so when we launch this container, we're also getting the separate identity as container admin. We can also poke around the file system. So if we wanted to go into the users directory, again, you're going to see that container admin directory as well as a container user directory, that sort of thing. So we get this separate view of the file system as well too. The same would go for the Windows registry as well. And whenever I go and stop this container let me exit it, you're going to see the process tree on the host associated with that container disappear. And then now I'm going to launch another instance of that container from the same image, mind you, but it's going to be a brand new instance of the container. And just like that, within the matter of a couple seconds, the process tree kicks right back up, and here we are in a pristine instance of this Windows container image. Cool. Okay, so that's all well and neat. You can start and stop containers. It's fun, but the really important thing is, you've got an application. You need to figure out how to get that into a container. So we talked a little bit about. I showed you this Docker images, and we use the server core image. More on that. So Windows containers, the cool thing about them is that containers generally, they can layer on top of one another. So this Windows Server Core and Windows Nano Server image are two of the images that Microsoft provides as what's called a base image. And you could take the base image, and that's where you then start layering in your application, your dependencies, and you can build on top of it. In fact, I could go and build a container image based on one of these images, put it on the internet, on what's called like a container registry, a public container registry. Docker has one. It's called Docker Hub. And someone else could go and take that and then go and build on top of it themselves. So it's this really cool layering approach that containers provide. And you can actually see right here, we have this IIS image, which is based off of Windows Server Core. And it's got the IIS feature already enabled. So here's an example where I can go and take this image. So let me go and grab the command. And I'm just going to run it. So this is, again, Docker run process isolation. We're going to run it detached this time. So the terminal is not going to be inside of the container. We're just going to start the container and it's going to be running in the background. We're going to map in a port. So we're going to map, let's do port 8080 from the host to the port 80 in the container where IIS is going to be listening. And we're going to start this. So now there on the left-hand side, we can see the process tree start to spin up for that container. And we're going to go to, boom. And just like that, we're greeted with the IIS welcome page, which is being served from within the container. It's really cool. And we didn't have to do anything extra. We just, started an instance of that IIS container image. So then from there, you could go and take that IIS container image, and you could layer in your own app within the IIS directory where apps are served from, that sort of thing, and you can get up and running with running your custom application just like that. And so let me exit out of this and let me stop the container. We're going to use this familiar name here. And just like that, we have cleared out the instance of that IIS container. Okay, let's transition back to the slides. All right, so let's talk about some of the common use cases for Windows containers. Windows containers work really great for these three broad categories. First one is app servers, so things that are based on .NET Framework or ASP.NET. Excellent candidate for migrating into Windows containers. The second thing, so web servers, things based on IIS. Fantastic candidate. I mean, we just saw that in the demo. I started up a simple IIS container. It maps really well to running those sorts of workloads in Windows containers. And then the third category is just a bigger bucket of these line of business server apps. So server apps that you have that are headless, that don't have a GUI or a device driver associated with them, that's going to be a good candidate for migrating into Windows containers. So if you have an application that you want to run on like a local machine and have a user interactively interact with it from a GUI, that's not a good candidate. And likewise, due to the nature of how Windows containers technology works, we don't support running workloads that have these special device drivers that they need to install on the host because containers are meant to be isolated. So there's some nuances and limitations there. So again, it's going to go back to as long as if it's headless, GUI-less, and device driverless, great place to start to think about moving that application into a Windows container. You don't even need the source code. Um, you can just take the executables and run them in a Windows container. Although granted, if you do have the source code, if there are some changes that need to happen as you take this app and you move it into a container, then it's nice to have that. But you can also migrate an app into a container, without the source code, just the app executable. As well, too, an important thing to call out is so we saw the identity of that Windows container in the demo was just this container administrator. We also offer integration with using GMSA. So GMSA is a group managed service account in your Windows container where the container can assume this service account identity to then go and authenticate with other resources that your app needs to access. And so that's something that I wanted to call out is it's an important thing to think about because a lot of people we find have a need for that. So we do support that. Also, we wanted to take a moment to say if you want to connect with the Windows Container Product team about your needs with supporting your Windows Server applications, then we'd love to get connected with you too. So you can either fill out the form or scan the QR code if that's more convenient. It should take you to the same form. And we just want to ask you a couple questions about your use case, and then if you'd like to, we'd love to get connected with you to have a chat and learn more about your needs. So please do reach out to us. Okay, so we've talked about the high levels of containers, Windows containers, that sort of thing. Now, as we think about running containers at scale, though, more often than not, you're not going to be just running a single instance of a container. In some cases, your application could look like multiple containers working together, where a container, there's discrete business logic in each container, and as a whole, they provide this experience. Or you're going to have an application that's running in a container and you need to run multiple instances of it to support the incoming traffic that your app is getting, those sorts of things. This is where container orchestrators really come into play. They provide so many capabilities for running containers at scale that you can see on the slide. There's a number of really nice features that it supports, like scaling out, logging, self-healing. If an application goes bad or a container goes bad, it'll try to self-heal, those sorts of things. Resource governance, all this monitoring integration. And as you think about starting to use container orchestrators in something like Azure or on the edge with AKS on Azure Stack HCI, there's all these great plugins that come along that make it all the more easier to run your containers at scale and monitor them and that sort of thing. So like I was saying at the beginning, container orchestrators are a very crucial thing to think about as you think about starting to use Windows containers. And this is where Raymond's going to come in and tell you all about how Windows containers integrate with AKS on premises and that sort of thing. So I'm going to hand it off to Raymond.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, that was an awesome demo on Windows containers. Craig has basically laid the foundation on container orchestrators, which is what I'm here to talk about. And specifically, I would like to talk about AKS on-prem. And later on, I'll present a demo on how you can quickly install AKS on a typical, should I say, infrastructure like Windows Server. But before we dive in, a bit of a history of AKS on Azure Stack HCI. Over the past 2 years, you've heard us talk about Azure Stack HCI as the host operating system for AKS on-prem or anywhere on the edge. During this time, there's a few questions that kept coming up again and again from a number of customers, especially our Windows Server customers. What about Windows Server? Or does AKS support Windows Server? Those sorts of questions. These customers were eager to leverage the existing Windows Server infrastructure on-prem to run container applications on top of Kubernetes. Since we announced GA back in 2020, we have supported AKS on Windows Server. In October of last year, we also announced support for Windows Server 2022 as a supported host for AKS on-prem. So what is AKS on-prem? This is how basically AKS is a fully supported container platform where you can run your cloud native applications in your on-premises environments. It's based on the open source Kubernetes container orchestrator. Most of the audience may be already familiar with AKS in the public cloud or AKS on Azure Stack HCI for that matter. But this same AKS is also the one that runs on Windows Server, so to say. And like all Kubernetes platforms, you do benefit from the automation that Craig just mentioned, like logging, scaling, self-healing, portability, and all those sorts of things that come with running container applications on Kubernetes. So what's unique about AKS in general, or AKS on Windows Server, is basically these three pillars, right? It's Azure hybrid by design. It's best for .NET apps on-prem, and of course our built-in security that we like, that our customers are especially excited about. And we'll dive into these shortly in the next few slides. So Azure hybrid by design, there's a common pattern that we've seen as we've worked alongside some of the customers who are running cloud native applications. And this is the general need for consistency, right? Consistency across applications or infrastructure that is in the cloud or on-prem. They want to be able to run the same applications, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud. So hybrid by design brings a community of customers that are sort of running applications in Azure and want to also deploy those same applications on-prem, right? Or vice versa, like you have your on-prem legacy applications that you want to move to the cloud or to deploy to Azure. Oftentimes you run into certain barriers, like having to choose different technologies, or you get worried whether the skills or resources that you have could be useful in the cloud or not. So with AKS, it sort of makes it simpler or easier for you to have these assets or applications easily transferable. You can basically build your applications on-prem and run or test them in AKS, and be sure that the same AKS that you're running on-prem is the same one that you will use to deploy to production in the cloud, or vice versa. Secondly, customers are excited about being able to use existing Windows Server infrastructure to deploy Kubernetes. I think with AKS, it's truly easy to get started, especially with Windows Admin Center and PowerShell. In less than 30 minutes, you will have a Kubernetes environment pretty much ready to go. And lastly, the built-in Azure Arc capability sort of gets you that connection to Azure so that you can manage your infrastructure, your estate, your application estate through the Azure portal. And this opens up a range of possibilities that that we'll talk about soon. So Craig talked about how easy it is to sort of move your .NET applications that say were dependent on IIS to a Windows container and have that deployed to a container orchestrator like Kubernetes. So AKS on-prem or AKS on Windows Server for that matter is the best platform for these sorts of scenarios. This is also another pattern that we've observed among Windows Server customers, right? Most of them are building and running, let's say, legacy or .NET applications, and at some point they want to be able to run these either in the cloud or on Kubernetes or in a more efficient way, for that matter. So here you have the option to package the app either in a Windows container like Craig mentioned, or you can even package it into a Linux container and run it on AKS in Linux or Windows node pool, or you could even do it side by side. Just last week, I had a call with a customer who has over 300 Windows nodes running on AKS, running them alongside another 20 Linux nodes, and they had just finished an upgrade that pretty much went smoothly, and they wanted to share that information. So yeah, that's kind of what is possible with AKS. One thing that also customers are excited about is the fact that this entire stack is fully managed by Microsoft. You pretty much have a single vendor to deal with. We've heard from, for example, the database community, the DBAs, on how standardization, on tooling, consistency are things that are very important to them when choosing a platform. So having Microsoft, or I would say taking some of this burden away, you don't have to worry about things like patching, backups, and complicated support agreements, yeah, with AKS. And lastly, yes, we talked about Windows Admin Center or PowerShell as the should I say the user experience part of deploying or managing your AKS clusters. Then, of course, security. Security is built in. The platform is designed with security at front and center of our minds. And here we leverage a lot of the investments that Azure has done in securing customer environments. Things like Azure Active Directory, Security Center, Sentinel. The other thing that we also do is we have monthly releases that make sure that the components that we're using in AKS on-prem, should I say, carry the latest security patches, so that yes, the platform is always secure and up to date in the same way that that we do in Azure. So when to use AKS on-prem? If you're wondering when you can use AKS on-prem, I would say you should consider AKS when you're a cloud native application developer who's building applications in the cloud, and for some reason you need to deploy these on-prem and you have a Windows Server environment. Yeah, by all means, spin up an AKS cluster and develop your applications against that. Or you are a .NET developer looking, or IT admin who's looking for a platform to host your .NET framework applications on-prem. You could modernize into things like Windows containers, like that cool technology to use for your on-prem .NET applications. And lastly, the DBA community, if you're looking for a platform to modernize your database applications, you can benefit from running data services on AKS. On AKS running on Windows Server. And here we have Azure enabled data services, which allow you to deploy SQL managed instances or Postgres on top of AKS. Then you could use Arc to manage these centrally, or to have Microsoft manage the patching, backups, etc. And generally taking care of all those painful tasks that folks hate so much. Now, let's take a look at what this looks like from, I would say, from the Azure hybrid point of view. This is how we kind of think about that stack, or our technology stack. At the bottom, you have your hardware. For this audience, this would perhaps be a virtualized Windows Server environment in a data center or some edge location that you can think of. Then on top of that, of course, some people would be running virtual machines, but you can essentially install AKS on AKS to host generally your container workloads. It basically becomes your container orchestration platform. Then on top of AKS, you can run your containers, or whether it's data services, whether it's .NET applications that you've containerized, Node, Java, you name it. You've basically opened up your infrastructure to a whole world of container orchestration or container applications. Then on the right side is Azure Arc. You can connect your clusters to Azure Arc to start managing your infrastructure from the cloud. And here you would have GitOps, for example, for pushing your configuration to your clusters and maintaining that consistency that our IT folks care about. You have policy to enforce policy across the board, both on-prem and in the cloud with Azure Policy. You have security. You can use Azure Defender for containers, and you can also monitor your clusters through the Azure portal. And so that, and also if for some reason you're not interested in the Azure Arc, then you also have the option of using Windows Admin Center to manage this infrastructure locally. All right. Before we dive into the demo, the actual demo, I would like to sort of walk you through what we'll be doing, what a typical AKS installation looks like. So when deploying AKS on-prem on any host, whether Azure Stack HCI or Windows Server, there are two things that we will be installing. The first is the management cluster. We also call this the AKS host. This is the first component that you install, which is basically our core orchestration component that we use to manage the platform. Think of it as the component that is used to manage other clusters, or the workload clusters. Customers who are familiar with Kubernetes in the public cloud may be a bit curious about this, but this is something that the public cloud AKS abstracts from customers. So you won't see this in the public cloud in case you're working with Azure. Then once you have the management cluster up and running, you can then create many workload clusters as your hardware can allow. Yeah. Workload clusters are the ones on which you will deploy your workloads. And basically the illustration to the right there shows a few containers that are running on top of in the workload cluster. I won't go into this, but especially for production use cases, I'm assuming that your hardware infrastructure is set up in such a way that you have things like shared storage, failover clustering for high availability. In the demo, I'll be mainly showcasing deploying on a single node Windows Server environment. Obviously not built for high availability, but still works in certain cases. Now I'll be transitioning into the demo section now. Right here is my single node Windows Server 2019 lab environment that I'll be using. We do not recommend single node deployments for production workloads. This particular server is set up for lightweight testing and definitely not built for any kind of production applications. I'll go ahead and connect to the server by clicking on the link. When the page loads, you'll see the server details that work shows. Now, assuming you have the latest release of Windows Admin Center installed, in the left menu, you will see Azure Kubernetes Service option right here. Click on that extension to get started. But when the page loads, you should see a setup button. I will go ahead and click on setup. On the prerequisites tab, you will see a list of prerequisites you need to install AKS HCI. A few prerequisites to keep in mind before you get started are you need an Azure subscription. Make sure you have this handy as step 5 will require this. Make sure you have registered Windows Admin Center with Azure, and you can do that by clicking on this link. Once you have all your prerequisites nailed down, click on System Checks. What happens here is Windows Admin Center will perform a number of pre-checks, such as storage, memory, firewall ports, just to make sure your environment has the right configuration for installation. In addition, Windows Admin Center also checks that you have the latest PowerShell modules installed on the server. An install button will appear as soon as that check is completed. So since this is a new setup, I don't have PowerShell installed. So I'll go ahead and click install and wait for the modules to be installed on the server. Once the PowerShell modules are successfully installed, the next series of steps are straightforward, enabling credential delegation, providing the host configuration, mainly networking, etc. Then registering in Azure. Assuming all this is standard information, I'll just skip this and forward to the review tab. Okay, so here we are on the review page. You will see basically a summary of the configuration you just provided. You can go ahead and click on apply. This will take a couple of minutes, so I'll skip again to the end. Okay, here we are. My AKS HCI cluster is now ready to go. The next step for me is to go ahead and start creating workload clusters that I'll be using to run workloads such as Arc-enabled data services. Thanks everyone for tuning in. In case you're interested in contacting or reading more about Windows containers or AKS on premises, Here are links to our product team pages. Feel free to reach out. In case you have any questions, feel free to also type them in the chat and the team will respond to you. Thanks for joining us.
This does conclude the audio portion of our webinar. However, we are going to stick around for an additional 10 minutes to answer any final questions you might have. One quick reminder, you can fill out our survey located in the bottom right-hand corner of your console. Please note that the questions and answers are available every time you access your webinar console with the on-demand link. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you at an upcoming webinar soon. Have a great day!